Welcome to Book Time with Ryan. I am Ryan, and today I will be talking about Until the Sea Shall Free Them by Robert Frump. Life, Death, and Survival in the Merchant Marine. I've had this book for a very long time. Why did I have this book for a long time? Because I'm pretty sure, 99.99999% sure that I got this when I was at the Coast Guard Academy. This was published in 2001. I started at the Academy in 2002. Why do I think I got this from there? Well, one, it's about a shipwreck. And we definitely talked about those at some point. But also, and this is a little view into my relationship with my old roommate. This fell out of the book. Obviously, Kyle and Ryan approach the opposite sex in different ways. Yes. I am far less violent. So this was in there for some reason. I'm pretty sure this was created maybe like 2004. So there. That's the only thing I have going for it that timing wise. I don't think I bought this though, but I really enjoyed it. It was referenced in a book that I recently read, The Finest Hours. I did a review. Check that out. I also watched the movie, and I did a review or the comparison between the book and the movie. So check that out too. This was referenced. I was like, you know what? Why not? Why not? I enjoyed The Finest Hours. I've started a new playlist, kind of a new series about nautical maritime books, not including whaling, and nonfiction. They're all nonfiction, and this is nonfiction. So this takes place in 1983, February 1983. So I was born in 83, on the other end of 83. Who know anything about The Finest Hours? That took place in 1952. So this is 31 years later. Did I do that math right? Yeah, I did. I did the math right. Go me. These are hard books to read because it is a true story and it deals with death, and they're very real people. And even though these books have to do with specific shipwrecks, it is not an isolated incident. Shipwrecks happen fairly frequently, more frequently than you would expect. Not necessarily large ones, although that does happen probably more than you expect too. But it's hard to read because it affects families. And I said that I went to the Coast Guard Academy and I got this. It was a required purchase from the Coast Guard Academy. There's a lot of Coast Guard in this, and what you find, I think, with the Coast Guard is it's often some parts of it are loved and some parts of it are hated and some parts of it aren't loved all the time. I was on a ship. If we're doing inspections for fisheries, if we were looking at safety gear, generally not loved. If we were in the middle of a search and rescue case, generally loved. And you can be both. In this book, it's more of the search and rescue piece of it, which is mostly aviation in this example, and the marine inspector part of the Coast Guard, which in this is not loved that much. Now, 1983, so I want to kind of place this a little bit. 1983, the Coast Guard had search and rescue capabilities, did not have rescue swimmers or aviation survival technicians at the time. The guys who jump from the helicopter or lowered from the helicopter, swim in really dangerous seas and pick people up and put them in the basket and bring them up in the helicopter. This is before the Coast Guard had that program. So in this example, the rescue swimmer who is working with the Coast Guard is a Navy rescue swimmer. His name's McCann. This story deals with another tanker, the T2. It's a bulk carrier, but it was a T2, which are the ships that were involved in The Finest Hours. Again, breaks up, although the breakup in this example probably happened after it sank. And we're dealing with a merchant vessel, a U.S. flagged vessel, which is poorly maintained. Lots of rust. And rust is a chemical reaction. So when metal breaks down into rust, there's not a whole lot you can do to fix that. It will eat away at more and more of the metal. Specifically, in this book, we are talking about the marine electric. And I think it's 605 feet, maybe? Carries coal. And it was doing a coal run from Norfolk, Virginia to Massachusetts. Quick run. Should take a couple days. We follow a number of characters. Most of them die. 3 of them live. The first part of the book is really about the marine electric, this trip, kind of the state of the ship, and the emergency at sea, which eventually resulted in it sinking. Part 2 involves the survivors, which there were a few, the rescuers, and then the Marine Board of Investigation. This is a board manned by the Coast Guard. There was also a National Transportation Safety Board meeting, too, that sat with the Coast Guard investigators, and that's the NTSB. So the Coast Guard and the NTSB were convening a review board, basically, to look at what happened, figure out who is to blame, how to avoid a similar emergency in the future. And so that's part 2 of the book. Part 3 of the book is basically after that. And most of the after that is kind of another round of boards and what the cases looked like in civil or criminal court. And then an epilogue, just kind of what happens in the end and what changes were made in the maritime community, and especially the Coast Guard. Because while the Coast Guard did a great job in the rescue portion of this, or tried to at least, although the elements were not in their favor. The inspection part of it, which would have been kind of certifying ships for being able to get underway, making sure that they were safe, did not reflect well on the Coast Guard and really didn't come out looking great. Now, I was a Coast Guard public affairs officer. I thought it was interesting. This came out in 2001, before I was in, but there wasn't the author was not exactly happy with the amount of assistance the Coast Guard gave him as he was writing, and that's unfortunate. And I think my approach a lot of times to bad news is get it out. If you made a mistake, talk about it. Talk about how you're going to fix it, because trying to hide it or trying to not talk about it isn't going to do anything. It's not going to help you out. And if you did something wrong, people are more forgiving when you understand that you did something wrong and you're making moves to change the way you do something instead of being silent about it. It's hard to get organizations to do that. But so that's it. So we're looking at the Marine Electric. The Marine Electric is doing a short trip up the coast, and they're heading into a storm. The condition of the Marine Electric's not great. The hatches, it's a bulk carrier. It's carrying a lot of, like, 26,000 tons of coal. Carrying a lot of coal, you have to worry about coal shifting. You have to worry about the way it's loaded, and you have to worry about the hatches that are over top of the area where the coals are, the holds. So they run into rough seas, and there is a fishing vessel that needs help, and they respond to that at the request of the Coast Guard. And that boat, that fishing boat, they're able to be brought in once they were past pumps. They were able to pump out their holds and get back into port, into safety. I think that was either the Delaware Bay or the Chesapeake Bay. Delaware Bay. Shortly after that, within hours of assisting that vessel and kind of having to stay on scene until they could be passed off and they were getting pounded, they start heading up north again. The person on watch starts to feel that the bow is riding lower. It's, if you're thinking about a ship, heavy seas, 20, 30, 40 feet, it'll ride up a wave, slam down, ride up, slam down. And what this was doing is you want to have it pretty even, so you're not either kind of bowing up or taking too much of the force in the middle of the ship. They realized that it was starting to ride a little lower in the front, or it felt like it wasn't responding as fast. If it was hitting something, instead of going up and slamming down, it was kind of going up and then it would dive a little bit and they'd get green water over the deck. And the lower that it rides, the bigger problem there is. So they had some members that were temporary members of the crew, and some that were permanent, some that had been on there for a long time. And they went and they checked them out, and the experts said, this is not good. We're going to probably have to abandon ship. Now, there's a lot of different reasons that somebody would want to abandon ship. There's a lot of different reasons that professionals would not want to. And a lot of them have to do with the liability that the officers on the ship have, especially the command. And if they abandon ship too quickly, they'll be fired. They may be liable. If something happens with putting their merchant mariners in the water, lifeboats, well, in 40-foot seas, being in a lifeboat that's 30 feet, 20 feet is not that safe. Even if your 605-foot ship is going down, you're not really safe going into the water. And this is February, and this is the North Atlantic, mid to North Atlantic. It's cold. It's really cold. And you do not have a long survival time in that kind of weather. This is 1983. Survival suits were not mandatory. There's some pretty basic rescue techniques. You still have some of the limitations on the speeds of ships in the area. You even have some limitations on the aircraft and what they can do. And you're dealing with pretty big distances. So if there's an emergency, people can't be there immediately. Now, the approach of a lot of merchant mariners was, if we're doing coastal kind of tramp steaming, there's going to be Coast Guard in the area. And if there's an emergency, they'll come and help us. True, but the time frame is not necessarily helpful, especially if you're going down fast. So they realize that this is going to be a problem, that they're riding low at the front on the bow, and they're going to have to consider abandoning ship. Well, they roll quickly. And why does that happen? Well, there's going to be an investigation to figure out what exactly happened. But if you think about a ship, do I have something? Okay, this is a ship. Now the ship is, this is the hull. This is just the hull. And this is the bow, this is the stern, this is port, starboard. It's riding through the waves. As it gets hit on the sides, it's going to rotate a little bit, kind of go back and forth. There's a bit of a roll. And that roll is going to, or yaw, the roll is going to kind of correct itself. As it rolls this way, there's a force that's pushing it back the other way. And this has to do with the center of buoyancy, the center of gravity, and how those two interact. But there's forces on this ship that make it want to stay up. It has to do with the forces from the water around it, the shape of the hull, all that kind of stuff. And generally, the lower the weight is, especially, and this is why in the old days they would load rocks on the bottom of some ships, some sailing ships, to give them more stability because they would be able to right faster. If you get higher weight, higher up on the ship, it'll start to slow that roll and it won't correct as fast as you'd like it to. And at some point, when that center of buoyancy, the righting arm, doesn't align in the right way with the center of gravity, it'll roll. So you'll start having these slow rolls and it won't correct as fast as it needs to. And as this is happening, the center of gravity and the center of buoyancy are starting to fall off of each other. And then eventually, if you get to a point where the center of gravity is pushing down and the center of buoyancy is pushing up, it could roll it. Now this happens if you take on water and the water's high up in the ship. It can happen if you have a shifting of heavy materials. That can change the way the center of gravity is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of buoyancy is. It can happen if you have a shifting of materials. That can change the way the center of bu the loads are distributed across the bow. It can happen if you have a lot of ice forming on a ship, and that's creating a lot of higher weight higher up on the ship. There's a lot of different ways that you can lose your stability. In this case, the marine electric was taking on water, and the holds filled up with water, and that water, they were already filled with hundreds or thousands of tons of coal. That water ended up being on top of the coal and started to slow down the righting action of the ship, and also made it less stable. And it was taking on water. So not only was it less stable, there was more water, higher up, less stable, lower in the water, so not as much freeboard. And as they took on more water and they rode lower, they would take more and more water. The hold covers were in poor shape, had holes in them, couldn't deal with tons of forces of the water hitting it. And eventually those started to give way too. As those gave way, you had a compounded problem of more and more water, and it wasn't necessarily evenly distributed. The other thing that you'll have sometimes with ships, and what you'll hear a lot of times, is watertight integrity, the importance of having barriers not only between the hull and the outside, but also within the hull, different compartments. That way, if there's any kind of flooding, it stays localized in that area. Because if you have water sloshing around the entire thing, this is like carrying a big pail of water, and now once it starts moving, it's really hard to keep the water from going out. If you have a bunch of little compartments, then that little movement, you don't feel the force as much. So this is big holds filling up with water high up in the ship. Boom, sinks. People go in the water, and it is freezing cold. They didn't have enough time to really abandon ship the right way. The ship rolled on top of a number of people that were never found. Other people, they couldn't launch the boats because of how far over they were listing. One of the boats was damaged. The other one was flooded. They also had some inflatables that could work, but people were having trouble getting in. And the problem is that cold water saps your energy so quickly, and they had so little time to prepare that once they were in the water, it was a race against time to even be able to, even if they got to a flotation device, they probably didn't have enough energy to climb out. And they succumbed to hypothermia, died, and drifted away and couldn't be found. In the end, the Coast Guard eventually showed up, although that was a little delayed. A couple merchant vessels showed up. They had somebody in the water who also, the Navy rescue swimmer, who was also suffering from early stages of hypothermia. They pulled more than 3 people out, but only 3 survivors. And the next phase was what happened. And there's this tug and pull between, did somebody who was in charge of the vessel do the wrong thing? Or was the company negligent? Did the company know about these issues that the ship had? Holes in the side of the ship, holes in the covers, gaskets that didn't fit, lack of watertight integrity. Did the company know that? And if the company knew that and hadn't corrected those issues, they were sending out a ship that should never have gone out. The other side of that is sometimes they were okayed to go out by the Coast Guard. And why did the Coast Guard sign off on these vessels that had cracks in them and holes? And the big showdown was really between the company, I think it's Marine Transportation Lines, and the first mate, Cusick. I think it's Cusick or Cusick. I wish I knew the way to pronounce it, but the company wanted to show that he did something wrong. Specifically, they thought it was run aground when they were trying to do the rescue, which would have kind of absolved everyone. But Cusick was very honest about what he saw. So then the goal of the company was to make it look like Cusick or Cusick didn't secure the anchors the correct way. And the first thing they had to do is have this Marine board with the Coast Guard to figure out what happened. And then following after that would be if anybody sued the company or sued individuals, the civil suits, and then possibly criminal recommendations from the board. So you follow Cussick especially, a couple of the survivors, some of their families, some of the families of the people who didn't survive or were involved with other vessels sinking. You get that experience, and it really reads like almost like a crime thriller. The court case, it was like watching Law and Order kind of, between the different members of the board, the defense or the respondents, whatever they're called, because nobody was a person of interest or a party of interest that would be blamed initially, at least. So it was really interesting to kind of watch that and see how that played out, and then really deal with a lot of the survival guilt that the survivors had. Why me? Why did I survive and other people didn't? I'm older. Why did I survive, but this young guy with a young family didn't survive? What did I do wrong? And just having to deal with those kind of questions, and depression and PTSD, and on top of all that, the legal challenges or questions, and the kind of the fight for their livelihood, because if they were found to have done something wrong, there was a good chance they could lose their licenses, and their livelihood was at sea. That was the story. This is 1983, 1984, 1985-ish. The Commandant at the time of the Coast Guard was Admiral Gracie. I've met Admiral Gracie. I used to be the Master of Ceremonies for the Coast Guard's wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington for Veterans Day, and Admiral Gracie and his wife would always come. So, but I didn't know he was involved with this until I read the book. It's a interesting read because no one's totally clear, no one's totally guilty, although the company looks pretty bad. The Coast Guard made some major changes with its inspections program. A lot of these T2 Liberty ship-esque ships out there that were very, very old, pre-World War II or World War II vessels that weren't constructed with rivets. There was a history of some of these ships splitting in half. They had tired iron or bad steel that would crack or become brittle in cold water, which a lot of these ships were involved with. It's also kind of a play between the companies, the unions for the crews, the government, the families, and how all that kind of played together, and the different kind of motivations or limitations for some of those groups. This was not a great time for regulation. This was not a great time to be a merchant mariner in the U.S., because if you did blow the whistle on something, you would just be fired, and there were a million other people waiting in line to take your spot. It really highlighted the issues with ships that were constructed with welding instead of rivets, and kind of the ongoing problems with the kind of the end of the board review of what happened and the recommendations made, and the ones that were adopted by the Coast Guard, signed off by the Commandant. The Coast Guard started a rescue swimmer program, which was huge. They also required survival suits, which we would call Gumby suits, but these are suits that are really made for cold weather survival or disasters, and really increase their survival rates. So they're expected now. We even drill on how to get into Gumby suits, but then that wasn't the case. And also about 70 vessels were put up, chopped up, and were done being used because they couldn't get the sign-off anymore because they weren't considered safe. So good things happened, but a number of people had died, over 500, to finally get to that point. And I think there's a lot of guilt in this. There's a lot of guilt felt by the survivors and the survival guilt. There should be guilt by the company. There's guilt felt by the coasties that didn't get things done or were kind of stuck in the bureaucratic review process, and felt like while they were stuck in that process, more mariners were at risk going afloat on these dangerous rust buckets. And that was kind of it. The one thing I don't know is there were, I think, 6 people that went down with the ship, and there were talks about removing them, cutting them out of the engine room, and I never saw any kind of conclusion to that? Any kind of closure on, did they ever remove them? Were they ever freed? Did the sea ever free them? The people that were left in the ship? I don't think so, but I don't know. And this was a while ago. Even though 2001 to me doesn't feel like that long ago, that's 23 years ago. That's a long time. That's almost a quarter of a century. So I appreciate it again. It's not a story that you can read and be like, wow, that's great. Because it's not. It's not a good story. It's a bad story. People died. Some of this was preventable. Some of it's not. Some of it is, you go to sea, at some point the sea can take you no matter what you do. There's that danger, there's that risk. But in these situations, it was really condition of the ship and put into those kind of sea states that doomed them. The other thing that I liked that Robert Frump did was he included examples of other cases, other examples at the time that the sailors would have recognized in their time. And it allowed us as the readers to see how this was not an isolated incident, and that the lessons, or at least the risks that were inherent in this line of work, but then also magnified by the conditions of these ships, that these situations were understood by the merchant fleet. And yet, still people were put at risk. So I give it 5 stars. I really appreciate it. I'm glad, finally, probably 20 years later, I actually read it. 25 years later, I actually read the book. 20 years later, I finally read the book. Found this little treasure in the book. I'm going to put it back in. Maybe in 25 years, we'll find it again. Somebody will. Before I go, one of the things that Cusick talked about was this song that he listened to and helped him survive. He was thinking about it. And I use that song as my intro and my outro. The song is called The Mary Ellen Carter, and it's by this guy named Stan Rogers, who's a Canadian. I found the song on iTunes, downloaded it, added it to this video. Well, bought it before I finished the book. And then I got to a chapter. This is after Cusick told Stan Rogers that the song basically helped him survive. And Stan Rogers invited him to a show at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he heard the story that Cusick had, and he said, I'm gonna write a song about that. And they were just excited for each other. They both cried. It was just a nice story. Well, Stan was going to a couple other places, and he was flying home, I think, or flying somewhere else in a DC-3? DC-9? DC-3. DC-9-3. Oh. A McDonnell Douglas DC-9-3. And they started smelling stuff. And it was some kind of burning, kind of plasticky smell on the flight. And they realized that there were these alarms going off and something was happening. They were going to have to do an emergency landing, and they went down and they landed. And as they opened the doors, there was a flash fire and smoke. And they were evacuating everyone, and about half the people survived. Stan Rogers was on that plane. This is days after he met with Cusick, and he ended up dying. And inside his briefcase, his burnt briefcase, was the letter from Cusick to him talking about what this song meant to him and how it helped him survive. And now Stan Rogers is dead. Stan Rogers was 31 years old, and this really hurt Cusick's recovery, because again, it was one of those why me, why these young guys dying kind of thing, and it was sad. I didn't know that when I bought the song. I was waiting to find the song that was about the Marine Electric, and then I found out by chapter 22 that Stan Rogers died and never got to write that song because he died just days after he met Cusick. So that's just kind of the backstory there. I almost forgot to tell you. So now you can listen to a little bit of that song on the way out. And again, thanks for being here today. I will talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye.
for we couldn't leave her there, you see, to crumble into scale. She'd saved our lives so many times, living through the gale, and the laughing drunken rats who left her to a sorry grave, they won't be laughing in another day. And you, to whom adversity has dealt the final blow, with smiling bastards lying to you everywhere you go, turn to and put out all your strength of arm and heart and brain, and like the merry Ellen Carter, rise again, rise again, rise again. Though your heart it be broken on life about to end, no matter what you've lost, be it a home, a love, a friend, like the merry Ellen Carter, rise again, rise again, rise again. Though your heart it be broken or life about to end, no matter what you've lost, be it a home, a love, a friend, like the merry Ellen Carter, rise again.